Governments take advantage of crises to amass more money and more power. There's a very smart liberal writer named Jonathan Chait who writes for the New Republic, and he wrote a devastating critique of Naomi Klein's book. He said it was not a very sharp book. One of the things he said was precisely what I'm saying, that she says it's the right that takes advantage of crises, but in fact it's often been the left that takes advantage. And here's what he wrote. Liberals could not have enacted the New Deal without the Great Depression. Communist revolutions have generally come about in the wake of wars. The liberal economist Victor Fuchs once wrote that national health insurance will probably come to the United States in the wake of a major change in the political climate, the kind of change that often accompanies a war, a depression, or large-scale civil unrest, unquote. So I wouldn't have the nerve to stand here and compare communist revolutions to the New Deal and national health insurance. But a writer in the New Republic says, oh yeah, the left uses these things like the New Deal, communist revolutions, and national health insurance. So he said it, not me. But he's making the same point that usually it is in fact more power that the government seizes in time of crisis, not a diminution of its power. So in 9/11, you did have all these things that happened after the shock. Then we had the economic shocks of 2008, almost 7 years to the day after 9/11. And what happened then? Did the Republican administration summon up the spirit of Milton Friedman and deregulate and privatize and cut government spending, as Naomi Klein would predict? No, of course not. It did what governments always do in times of crisis. It seized new powers over the economy. It dramatically expanded the regulatory powers of the Federal Reserve and injected another $1 trillion of inflationary credit into the banking system. It partially nationalized the biggest banks. It appropriated $700 billion with which to intervene in the economy. It made General Motors and Chrysler wards of the federal government. It wrote a bailout bill giving the Secretary of the Treasury extraordinary powers that could not be reviewed by courts or other government agencies. That's what governments do in time of crisis, and that's a reason that the freedom movement needs to be prepared and gear up whenever we anticipate a crisis like that. And now, the Obama administration is continuing this drive toward centralization and government domination of the economy. I could throw a lot of numbers at you, but the numbers change so fast it's impossible to keep up with them. A government budget that is about double what it was 9 years ago. Now, much of that is the fault of George W. Bush, but the last few $100 billion obviously come from this new administration. A federal deficit of $1.8 trillion. That's the size of the federal budget when Bush became president. That's how far we've moved in the 8.5 years since Clinton left office. And one of the interesting things about the Obama administration is this idea of the shock doctrine is absolutely right. Governments use crises to seize power, but they don't usually say so. They don't usually say that's what they're doing. This administration is happily going around telling people that's what they're doing. Rahm Emanuel, the White House Chief of Staff, said on a nationally televised interview, the economic crisis facing the country is an opportunity for us. After all, he said, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And this crisis provides the opportunity for us to do things that you could not do before, such as taking control of finance, energy, education, and health care. And the really interesting thing is, when Emanuel said that, people did point it out. I wrote about it. Some other people wrote about it, talked about it. On TV, they said, look, Rahm Emanuel is saying they're going to use this crisis to seize power. And this did not faze this administration. Hillary Clinton went to Europe and said the same thing. Joe Biden said the same thing. And in his weekly radio address, President Obama said something very similar. We're going to use this crisis to do things we couldn't do otherwise. Things the American people would have resisted had it not been for this crisis. And in that, they are absolutely learning the lesson of 9/11. You know, some people say the stimulus bill is the left's 9/11, or the left's Patriot Act. Because after 9/11, you had the Patriot Act, which sort of threw in everything law enforcement had wanted for a decade, but couldn't get through a skeptical Congress. All of a sudden, after 9/11, it sails through Congress in a couple of weeks. And the stimulus bill, what is the stimulus bill? It's a package of stuff the left has wanted to spend money on for years, but couldn't get through Congress in a time that was not a crisis. So now they've got it all. You know all the headline things the Obama administration is doing. They're trying to turn health care over to the federal government. They're trying to turn education over to the federal government. They're trying to take over energy for the federal government. Obviously, they're trying to impose huge new federal regulations on the finance industry. But there's an under-the-radar assault on a lot of aspects of the American economy. Without anybody really noticing, people in the Obama administration are moving to take control or to regulate out of existence 401ks, private health plans, workplace flexibility, to use antitrust to break up companies and industries, to impose pay regulations, not just on companies that take federal money, but on all companies, because they think that Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, and Barack Obama know what the pay of American executives should be better than stockholders and corporate managers do. They want to take all these things over, and then they have a list as long as your arm of the taxes they want to raise to pay for this stuff, and yet even with all those taxes, they are projecting unprecedented deficits as far as the eye can see. As I said a minute ago, I think for a long time, lots of us were just shell-shocked by the daily barrage of assaults on economic freedom. I know that's the way I felt picking up the newspaper every morning last fall. But there were also two other factors that I think have been hampering the freedom movement. First, too many small government advocates always felt some ambivalence about taking on the Bush administration. They thought somehow Republicans really do believe in smaller government and free markets, no matter how many trillions in new spending they run up or how many Americans they arrest without access to a lawyer. And that misperception limited our ability to organize a broader freedom movement to protect freedom during the Bush administration.